Hi there, I'm Darren Chitty and I will be presenting my paper on partially asynchronous global parallel genetic algorithms. Basically, parallel CPUs are everywhere we look now. Our computers have them with CPUs with up to 64 cores. On a AMD Threadripper or an Intel i9 has at least 6 to 8. You have GPUs with thousands of CUDA cores which operate in a very slightly different way to CPUs, but again, difficult to take advantage of. And even things like the Raspberry Pi Cortex chip has 4 cores on it, so even edge devices have parallel computing ability on them. So to maximize speed, most algorithms now require a parallel implementation to be able to operate with maximum speed on a computer, and for computationally intensive algorithms that's a necessity. And evolutionary computing is a primary candidate for speeding things up, mainly because they're very easy to implement in parallel because they're population based and the individuals, the population members, are largely independent with only a small amount of dependency between them with crossover copying different individuals. But whilst it's easy to get a speed up with an evolutionary algorithm to put it into a parallel form, is it optimal for the CPU? Are you getting maximum performance from your parallel CPU? And it's very difficult. There are a range of models that you can implement, and it's difficult to get that pure speed out of it without other issues cropping up. So here we're going to present several different parallel models for a global genetic algorithm. So the first of these would be a synchronous, a simple synchronous global GA. So at each generation, there's the creation and the evaluation of population members occurs in parallel, but only at each generation. So each parallel thread gets to do a proportion of the population to create and evaluate, and once they've done their little bit of work on those particular population members, they then stop and wait until all threads are finished, because sometimes there can be different lengths of time it takes to compute different individuals. There could be more calculations required. So as you can see on the right hand side, you can see there are different amounts of time that each task might take, and you can see it's distributed quite evenly through the time, and each generation all threads start up. And the advantage of this process is that it exactly mirrors a sequential GA. So the results you'll get if you run it sequentially with no parallelism at all, you'll get the same result from a sequential parallelism. But the disadvantage is underutilized CPU cores, which you can see again from the diagram on the right hand side. There's a lot of grey space between tasks. There's a lot of waiting that threads have to do, and this results in a runtime cost. Alternatively is an asynchronous parallel genetic algorithm where threads don't wait for all the other threads to finish doing their individuals and starting the next generation. They just plough on and get on with the next generation. And a multi-population GA is a pure example of this, where each thread has a separate subpopulation, and occasional migration occurs between different subpopulations, but they can crack on and do their evaluation of their subpopulation and the next generations. But the problem with this method is that you need to have a viable subpopulation size on each processor core, which realistically you would say would be a minimum of 32. And so the benefits becomes reduced as we get increasing parallelism, which we're seeing with a Threadripper with 64 cores. If you had a subpopulation of 32, you need a population size in total of 2048. So there's kind of speed advantage that you would get. It seems to be negated from doing that. And moreover, you could create a processor with 128 cores on it. You're not going to be any faster because you'll just have to run more populations. So a global GA of a fixed population size might be a better alternative if you want to get the speed up. But the problem with asynchronous execution is obviously one thread could be reading a population member for crossover, whilst another thread is actually updating that one because it's on its core that it's doing. So this can lead to invalid solutions, especially for permutation type problems like the travelling salesman problem, where a unique set of numbers have to be in the solution. So you could get the same number in twice, which is an invalid solution for the travelling sales problem. Thread locking can prevent these errors, but it means that threads are essentially paused, which is almost exactly the same as being in a synchronous parallel model. But we can see from the diagram on the right how much faster a purely asynchronous version of a genetic algorithm would be much faster and no gaps for waiting for the threads, only at the end basically. So given that we can't have thread conflicts and we want to avoid those so we have no thread locking, we can have modern CPUs have huge amounts of memory, so gigabytes of memory now. So we could utilize this instead to prevent basically a thread creating a solution, another one trying to read it at the same time or updating it. So we use something called working memory. It's a very simple solution. Each time a chromosome is created, essentially a new update to the population member is placed in a new memory location than the old one, and the pointer tracks where that one is, what's the latest version, which would then be used in tournament selection by any other thread. It would then pick up the latest solution available for that one, and we know that one then won't be updated because it's essentially an old one, because when the next update occurs it will occur in the next memory location. However, if we were to do this for every single generation, if we were running for 50,000 generations, say, we would need gigabytes, which is even beyond what CPUs have. So we need a smaller amount of working memory, so a few hundred chromosomes should be sufficient, dependent on how fast, how many threads you've got, etc., and how big your population size is. And if a planned update would then be reaching at the end of this working memory, it wraps around back to the beginning and starts again, so a first in, first out. And this, so that's why we use several hundred here, because it then just prevents one thread getting several hundred generations ahead. It shouldn't really be an issue in that case. So we're going to test this synchronous and asynchronous version that we've created here with a working memory using the travelling salesman problem, because this is a permutation problem, so it would be a problem if invalid solutions occurred, because we're not going to be using any thread locking here, so it's just purely letting it run and there shouldn't be any issues. And we're going to use 6 TSP problems from the TSP library up to nearly 4,000 cities. The GA parameters used, we're going to need to try different population sizes, 32, 64, 128, 256, and 100,000 generations, BMX crossover, and a 1 in 3 chance of mutation occurring with swap inversion and insertion mutation. We're also going to use 2-opt local search. Now this is important because we're looking also at uneven computation, because this is again why threads can end up having to wait for others in the synchronous version, because another one's got a lot more work to do. And this can happen with 2-opt, because 2-opt continues improving a solution until no improvements can be made, and that could be a large number of improvements, or it could be a small amount of improvements. And also you don't use it all the time, you only use it with, say, a 1% probability like we're using here, so it can create very uneven computation. And the experiments will run on an AMD Ryzen 2700 processor. This has 16 cores on it, although only 8 physical, so only 8 real ones and the 8 virtual ones, but these allow basically when a thread stalls because it needs memory, another one can take over control of the processor core while it's waiting for the memory fetch. And if we look at the run times that we got from using these models, we can see quite clearly the synchronous version is much, much slower for all population sizes, probably around 10 times slower than our asynchronous version with the working memory. And we can see why this is with the CPU occupancy. We can see we're getting close to 100%, certainly with the larger population size and bigger problems for the asynchronous version, and the synchronous version is nowhere near, and this is because all the threads are having to wait, potentially while some are doing 2-opt. But there's an issue, and this is in terms of the accuracy of the solutions we get for the travelling salesman problem. We can see that the synchronous version is pretty much better in all cases, apart from possibly with using a larger population size. I think it's only at a slight advantage. And the reason for this is that one thread can be many generations of evolution ahead of another, because another one has stalled or it's doing 2-opt. And because it's been doing more evolution, its solutions tend to get better because it's evolving, and they then dominate the whole population and reduce the diversity that essentially you get there. And this can happen, as I say, because using 2-opt local search, all threads can stall whilst waiting for memory from main memory rather than not in the cache memory. So we need a solution to prevent threads getting so far ahead. And the answer is to combine both models into a partially asynchronous version. So we're now a set of permissible asynchronous generations, but at that point then threads have to then wait for the rest to catch up. And we can see this on the right with a diagram. Every third generation threads have to wait. So we still get the advantages of an asynchronous version, but hopefully we should get some better results from using a partially asynchronous implementation. And we can see this here. We've tried some different sizes with a population size of 32, and we're using asynchronous generations of 5,000 down to 50, and we can see quite clearly accuracy improves the smaller number of allowable asynchronous generations. However, this comes at the opposite side of a runtime cost. So we can see as we use this very small asynchronous generations, it ends up with the largest computation time. So a balance needs to be struck between the number of partially asynchronous generations and the accuracy that you desire and speed. But here we look at the convergence rates of all three models. So we're doing the synchronous and the asynchronous, and three settings of the partially asynchronous at 50, 500, and 1,000 generations of asynchronous evolution, and we're running them all for the same amount of time as it would take the synchronous version to run. So if it takes a certain amount of time for 100,000 generations to be run, and asynchronous can do half the time, then it can run double the number of evolutionary steps, so it can just carry on evolving for the same amount of time. And here we can see that basically the synchronous version is much poorer than the rest on the red line. The black line, which is the purely asynchronous version, if it's allowed to evolve with its extra speed, it actually can be just as good as any of the partially asynchronous. In fact, in the top right, it is the best performing approach there, simply because it can just run more evolution because it's running so much faster. But the partially asynchronous 500 generations is pretty much there or thereabouts, and in the largest problem, it actually has a significant advantage. And we apply this again to the different population sizes, 64, 128, and 256. And again, we can see there's not a huge amount of difference when they're allowed to run for the same amount of time rather than for a fixed number of iterations. And we can see quite clearly the synchronous version is poorer, and we get advantages for both the asynchronous and the partially asynchronous. But as I say, if we run for the same amount of time as a synchronous version, we're getting no speed advantage. So if we're running with the fixed iterations, it could be advisable that the partially asynchronous version is the better way to go, unless of course you don't want any speed advantage, you just want to take advantage of the processor as much as you can. So in summary, parallelism of processors is increasing, and they're everywhere around us. And an asynchronous implementation gets the best performance from it, but you have the problem with clashes or conflicts with memory. So a working memory works best with a GA, but this affects the accuracy, and a partially asynchronous version will bridge that gap. However, with pure speed from the asynchronous version, we can just run more evolution, we can overcome that accuracy loss. So you've got to decide between the fine balance between speed and accuracy, and what's more important to you. Do you want the evolution to run in half the time and get your results in half the time, or are you quite happy just getting as much out of the processor as you can? To answer this question, probably auto-tuning would need to be used to find the ultimate solution between the number of partially asynchronous generations and what we could get in terms of accuracy versus speed. And that will probably be the next bit of work that we would look at with this piece of work, and maybe look at GPUs as well. And thank you for listening.